When we think about World War I, it's easy to just picture bigger armies and bigger battles. But it was so much more than that. It was a conflict that completely rewrote the rulebook for warfare itself. In this explainer, we're going to break down how this one single event changed, well, pretty much everything we thought we knew about war. So, let's just dive right in with the big question, the one that's going to guide us through this whole thing. How did one conflict, just one, manage to change the very meaning of the word war? All right, to really get a handle on this, we've got to start with a core concept that changed absolutely everything, and that idea is total war.
So before 1914, wars were kind of contained. They were mostly seen as contests between professional armies on some distant battlefield. But total war, that threw all that out the window. Suddenly, the entire nation becomes a war machine. We're talking factories, farms, even the people back home. Everyone and everything was mobilized for one single purpose: victory, no matter the cost.
And you can see just how dramatic that shift was, right? It wasn't armies versus armies anymore. It was nations versus nations. The whole country was the battlefield now. And the most tragic part of all this? That line between soldier and civilian, it got completely blurred. For the first time on such a massive scale, civilians themselves became targets.
Okay, so think about it. If you're going to ask an entire country to make these huge, life-altering sacrifices, you can't just send out a memo, right? You've got to persuade them. You need to convince millions of people all at once.
And that right there is your propaganda becomes one of the most powerful weapons of the war. Every single nation launched these massive campaigns, and their goal wasn't to inform people. No, it was to literally shape a new reality for their citizens, to control the national mood, and make sure that support for the war never, ever wavered.
So how'd they do it? Well, the propaganda playbook was pretty clear. First, you demonize the enemy. You turn them into these inhuman monsters. And at the same time, you glorify your own side. Your cause is righteous, it's heroic, it's noble. What this does is create this incredibly powerful us versus them mentality that makes any sacrifice seem not just worth it, but absolutely essential.
And this, right here, is the absolute key to understanding it. It was never really about the facts, it was about creating an emotional reality. The whole point of the propaganda was to make people feel like they were under attack, to make them furious, to make them incredibly proud. Because if you can control the emotions, the government knew the people would never question the war.
All right, now let's shift gears from the home front to the front lines. Let's take a look at how this new era of total war was fought with some terrifyingly new tools of destruction.
World War I basically turned into a showcase for industrial-scale killing. I mean, the same factories that were building cars and cities were now just churning out weapons with a lethality that was just unprecedented. It completely transformed the battlefield, on the ground, up in the air, and even under the sea.
Okay, look at this number. 500 rounds per minute. Just try to wrap your head around that. Now, picture the old way of fighting. Soldiers bravely charging across an open field. Against that kind of firepower, it wasn't bravery anymore. It was basically a suicide mission. This one weapon completely changed the math of the battlefield.
And then came something even darker. Chemical weapons. Poison gas brought a whole new level of horror to warfare. It was this terrifying, invisible enemy that caused just unimaginable suffering. We're talking slow, agonizing deaths. It was, quite literally, terror as a weapon.
So to try and counter this defensive nightmare of the trenches, a new machine was born, the tank. And what's kind of wild is that they were first disguised as mobile water carriers, water tanks, to keep them a secret. Their whole purpose was to do what soldiers just couldn't do anymore: cross that deadly stretch of no man's land, and finally, hopefully, break the stalemate.
So you've got all these new, deadly weapons, but what did that actually mean for the soldiers on the ground? How was the war actually fought, day in and day out? Well, it created this: trench warfare. This became the iconic, brutal image of the Western Front. We're talking about millions of men living, fighting, and dying in these huge, complex networks of ditches, basically just staring at each other across this barren, bombed-out wasteland they called no man's land. And here's the crazy irony. All of this new, destructive technology didn't actually speed the war up. It ground it to a halt. Defensive weapons like the machine gun and barbed wire were just so effective that trying to attack was almost impossible. And that created this horrific, bloody stalemate that just dragged on for years, with millions of lives being lost for just a few feet of muddy ground.
You know, this brutal stalemate had another major consequence. As the casualties just kept piling up, the European powers realized they needed more soldiers, a lot more. And they had to look way beyond their own borders to find them. This is where the conflict was about to become truly global.
To keep feeding the meat grinder of the war, the European empires drafted millions of men from their colonies all around the world. We're talking soldiers from India, Africa, China, Southeast Asia, all being pulled into this brutal European fight. They were fighting and dying for empires on battlefields thousands of miles from their homes. This is what really made it a world war.
And here's where the story gets even more tragic. So many of these colonial soldiers fought bravely, holding on to the hope that their incredible sacrifice would be rewarded, maybe with more freedom, maybe even independence for their countries after the war. But for the vast majority, that promise was completely broken. And that feeling of betrayal planted the seeds of resentment that would fuel anti-colonial movements for decades to come.
Now, for the first 3 years of the war, America was officially neutral, but German actions just kept pushing and pulling them closer to the edge. First, you have the sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania, which really turned public opinion against Germany. Then, in 1917, Germany decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And the final straw, the shocking Zimmermann telegram, a secret message trying to get Mexico to attack the U.S. That was it. By April of 1917, America was in.
America's entry really tipped the scales, and it ultimately led to an Allied victory. But the way the war ended would turn out to be just as important and just as destructive as the way it was fought.
So when everyone gathered to figure out the peace treaty, there were two totally different ideas clashing. On one side, you had U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. He was pushing for what he called a peace without victory. Basically, a lenient deal that wouldn't leave Germany feeling bitter and wanting revenge. But on the other side, you had Britain and France. They had suffered unimaginable losses, and they wanted one thing and one thing only: to punish Germany.
And in the end, punishment won. The Treaty of Versailles was incredibly harsh. It forced Germany to take all the blame for the war and pay absolutely crippling reparations. But this bitter peace didn't solve anything. It really just hit the pause button. In fact, a lot of historians argue that it created the perfect storm of anger and resentment in Germany that led directly to the rise of extremism and to a second, even deadlier, World War just 20 years later. And all of this leaves us with a really big, thought-provoking question, doesn't it? World War I showed the world what happens when you combine the idea of total war with new, terrifying technology. It really makes you wonder, when we chase after total victory at any cost, do we risk creating a legacy not of peace, but of total destruction?